So I wrote borrow as a way to understand the sort of cultural meanings of debt in relationship to the material meanings of debt. My very first book, Debtor Nation, was really about policy. It was really about the finance, the business behind it. And the second book was really about how those are shaped and reshaped by culture. And the reason I wrote this is because I realized that so many of the conversations we've been having in the last few years, perhaps not among our sort, but among most people, was that the causes of the current crisis, the causes of our current indebtedness, are cultural. Morally, America lost its way, the sexual revolution, the breakdown of the family, we've all become lazy, and that all these cultural factors, like those, make us immoral. And thus, we become debtors. But the debt relation is a two-sided one. It is, for a loan to happen, you need to have a borrower, but you also, most importantly, need to have a lender. And so this is where my work has focused, not as much on the culture of borrowing, though that's obviously very much a part of it, but also the culture of lending, these sort of cultural ideas, as well as financial practice, business practices that underpinned those kinds of shifts. And so when I began working on this about a decade ago, as many of the historians of capitalism in the room will attest, nobody cared. Nobody cared about the history of the economy. The history of economy was a moribund field. In a lot of ways, the Penn History Department kept the flame alive during those dark years. But yet, there are, of recent, after the crisis, unfortunately, people once again began to take an interest in us and the things we had to say about crises, the things we had to say about institutions, about the ways in which markets work and don't work. And particularly in the last few years, in terms of Occupy, statistics that I was bandying about and others were bandying about, screaming into the wind a few years ago in 2007, 2008, about inequality, are finally now common sense. I gave a talk at Harvard Business School in 2007 and talked about slides that showed, that wage stagnation had occurred. And now today, this is common sense. When I show you the slide in a minute, you'll say, I've seen this all before. Lewis, you're so boring, which is reasonable. I try to be boring like most historians. But at the time, the room erupted in argument. How could this be the case? The GDP's gone up. This isn't possible. Per capita GDP is through the roof. And the gentleman nodding in agreement knows exactly what I am talking about. And yet now it is obvious. And yet the causes of the connection, the larger connections between inequality, which we now also cast in moral terms. Inequality is a moral problem. Inequality denigrates the democracy, destroys the roots of the republic. It doesn't, we have had a harder time trying to make connections between the effects of that inequality and the larger crisis within capitalism today. And yet, there are echoes of the past. Like in the past decade, Americans of the 1920s used credit to live beyond their means. But it didn't interfere with the development of manufacturing. In fact, it promoted the development of manufacturing. In fact, it promoted the development of many jobs. And yet it also, at the same time, was part and parcel of a new regime of inequality. And in fact, many of the things we think we invented very recently, like mortgage-backed securities or selling cars on credit, also existed, also were at the core of the 1920s economy. And so when you start to see slides like this, which will comfort, I think, many of the people who like math better than pictures in this room, you're used to seeing now this data of the peak of inequality in 28 and 2007 at 24%. So our colleagues in California have now popularized. We're used to seeing slides like this about the median male wage, its explosive growth in the post-war, its stagnation since then. We're used to understanding what this all means. But yet, seeing something like this really drives it to the gut. A simple regression. A simple regression that says, what would our economy look like if we just continued as we had? Double. Median male wage would be double what it is today. And so it is not just the case that inequality has no larger connections. Inequality is deeply connected with wages and with debt, as we'll come to. And why is this? Why is this? It's because you either have to keep an industrial mass production economy going with wages or with debt, one or the other, though they do have very different consequences. While credit can be used for a while to substitute for wages in the short run, eventually the bills need to get paid. And American workers have not been paid in a very long time. And so while we need to recognize the differences, and there are many differences between the 1920s and the last decade, we also need to realize what is stunningly similar. A dead-end housing boom, economic inequality, and most importantly, an anxiety about where profitable sites of investment would be found, or profitable sites of investment will be found. And so rather than see this from the demand side, I would urge us to consider this more and more as a problem on the supply side. How did it come to be that so much money was invested in consumer debt, which is an economic cul-de-sac, which is an empty calorie, as I've called it, because it's like guns. You know, it doesn't produce anything except war. Cul-de-sac houses produce nothing except, you know, comfortable living spaces, but they produce no value. What does it mean when so much of our economy is being invested in this way?